So I wanted to jump to the next video, which is the current Italian Prime Minister Meloni, and a couple of the comments that she had to say.
Problema di compatibilità tra la cultura islamica o certa interpretazione della cultura islamica e i diritti e i valori della nostra civiltà. A me non sfugge che la gran parte dei centri culturali islamici in Italia sono finanziati dall'Arabia Saudita e l'Arabia Saudita è una nazione che a casa sua applica la Sharia e Sharia significa lapidazione per l'adulterio, pena di morte per apostasia, pena di morte per omosessualità. Credo che queste questioni vadano poste, che non vuol dire generalizzare sull'Islam, vuol dire porre il problema che c'è in atto un processo di islamizzazione dell'Europa che è molto distante dai valori della nostra.
Okay, so she talked about a few things in her very quick
burst of words.
Homophobia, all these things in there, like death for apostasy, all these things which we've actually covered on the program already quite a lot, which is completely false. But the idea which we were talking about, this perception that in Western countries Muslims can't integrate because Islam is the problem, and at its core it stems from this anti-Semitism and dislike of the disbeliever, so the non-Muslim is integral within the Quran. Apparently this is what they would say, and it's integral not only to Islam but to Arab culture. Do you feel this is the case, Roya, before I turn to Noor?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously, as you've said, this has been debunked so many times.
Yeah.
That there is no such thing in Islam, as what she is saying. And I think it also stems from not only ignorance about Islam, which I think you will also cover in more detail, but it also stems from historical sort of ignorance of Europeans, that they're just not aware of how Muslims played a role in setting up what is now known as Western values. So you've talked about this on the program before as well, that, for instance, in Holland specifically, it were the Ottomans who helped us with Dutch independence, and they helped. And the reason for that was because in Holland, religious freedom was in so much danger. Actually, it wasn't even in danger; it wasn't even there. The Ottomans came to establish that. And it was historically, actually, it was a Jew who wrote like the first letter to invite the Ottomans to help the Dutch. So that's quite an interesting fact about Dutch history.
And it was to help the Dutch, establish religious tolerance.
Establish religious tolerance, but also establish a separate state from the Spanish, because we were under Spanish rule.
I see.
So it was to establish religious freedom and Dutch independence. And the Ottomans, they were like our real hero at that point, which has been just completely forgotten, and it's not really taught in like history books as much as it should be.
Yeah.
I mean, it's mentioned in some ways, very subtly, but it's really not as big as it should be.
Yeah.
And this doesn't only go for like Dutch history; it goes for general Western history as well. That there is this seemingly like historical dementia surrounding Islam's role in Western history, and where they try to frame this whole idea of Judeo-Christian values or like Western values, where actually that's Islamic values.
They should call it Abrahamic values.
Yes,
Abrahamic values.
Yes, but it's quite interesting that they could have said Abrahamic values.
Yeah,
but they are explicitly excluding Islam from that narrative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're like really exclusively picking out Islam,
putting them to the side.
Yeah, putting them to the side, sort of framing them as this intolerant religion. Well, it was actually the Muslims who lived with the Jews peacefully for like 1,000 years. So like in Spain, but also in the Ottoman Empire, it was completely normal to have like different beliefs living together.
Yeah,
and they had like most tolerance among nations at that time. It was really unique among their contemporaries to have religious tolerance in that way and religious freedom in that way.
Yeah.
And that was not some cultural or political like pragmatism.
Yeah.
It came from ideals as well. It came from the idea that Islam allows people of different beliefs to live together.
Yeah.
100%.
Which is what you would expect,
Yes.
There's nothing that you would gain by persecuting a minority or another group of people. In fact, you gain much more by including them and involving them within your political structures, within your society at large.
Yes.
And I remember reading some time ago and watching some lectures about the fact that actually the golden age of Judaic scholarship happened under the Islamic rule.
Exactly.
And that's that's something that's not talked about at all. And I remember you actually mentioned, just going back to the Dutch kind of history of the independence from the Ottomans, is that in the Dutch parliament, were you saying above there was a throne and they've got some mural or something to the Ottoman people? Is that right?
So there is this painting in one of the rooms of Dutch parliament, which, if I'm not mistaken, is like right above the seat of the president of that room.
Yeah.
And it's a painting of the Ottomans. So what that depicts. So essentially, the mural is about the people who helped with Dutch independence, and the first picture is of Ottomans. So it sort of really shows this beautiful, almost guardianship over like Dutch society and Dutch tolerance and Dutch freedom, which we are really known for historically as well.
Yeah.
But that the Ottomans almost really were a guardian of that.
Yes.
And they were, the ones who really helped us establish that.
Interesting.
So that's beautiful, and not many people know about that.
That's really interesting. But were there any other, any other kind of instances in history, in Islamic history, that that kind of showed this tolerance as well from non-Muslim kind of communities within an Islamic population?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the most famous examples quite early on in Islam is the example of the Caliph Umar. So when he came to Jerusalem, he actually reinstated the Jews into Jerusalem, which had been expelled at the time. So, as you probably know, the place where the temple used to be, it was like a garbage dump area, and he cleaned it up with his own hands, with his companions and with the people there, and then he reinstated Jewish families into Jerusalem. So I know you've covered this earlier as well, that's just a beautiful example of how Islam cared for the Jews in the Holy Land.
Yeah.
That when the Muslims took over the Holy Land, that was when the Jews were really reinstated there. And that just goes to show, Islamic tolerance and the way that Islam really thinks about people of different beliefs.
Yeah. There's kind of a whiplash effect, I find, from historical oppression of Jewish people in Europe, because it was in Europe that had the pogroms, and it was in Europe that had undergone the Holocaust of the Jewish people, but also of a number of other ethnic groups that weren't tolerated under the Nazi rule. And I feel like there's such a whiplash against that they don't. Although they do commemorate the fact that they had managed to sort of fix the situation somehow by not dealing with the Jewish refugees and just deciding to dump them in a land that they wanted to establish as Israel now, which I think was one of the most anti-Semitic things they could do personally. Instead of actually reintegrating and apologizing and compensating the Jewish community in Europe and saying, no, you are one of us, let's start again. They just said, no, we'll just kind of like, here's your land, you can go and stay there. I mean, it's just, but this attitude is spread to basically any other community that seems like the other, whether at the time it was a Jewish community, but now it's to Muslims, basically.
I know what you say is very interesting, because we know in Holland as well that there are plenty of examples of Jews who survived the Holocaust coming back to Holland and their houses just being taken over by the Dutch people and not being given back to them. And so that's, it's so shocking that then after that the Israeli state is established, again with support of European powers, really, as you said, to get rid of the Jews in Europe. That's what they wanted. So they established this Jewish state, and now these Jewish people are essentially doing the same there as well, where they're expelling the Palestinians, and they have been doing this for like the past 80 years now. Which is just such a sad narrative. That it's like constant expulsion of these ethnic people.
And we haven't been learning anything from obviously the history.
It's a goldfish memory.
Constant repetition of what of history, essentially.
And Noor, if I can turn to you a little bit more, like can you talk a little bit more about kind of like Islam, early Islam, and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and just kind of again, just trying to dispel these ideas that Islam is inherently intolerant. The Prophet, peace be upon him, God forbid, was some kind of intolerant ruler. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, definitely. I think I would first start with Medina, which is one of the earliest examples of tolerance and coexistence. When Hazrat Muhammad ﷺ, the Holy Prophet, moved to Medina, there was a constitution that was written, and that's to make sure that all the rights of the other minorities are secure and they have their rights saved.
And that was specifically called the Charter of Medina.
Yes. So for that one, the main point is first that all the Jews and the Christians are recognized as equal members in the society. They are meant to pay jizya, which is the amount that we pay as zakat. As Muslims, we're meant to contribute from our income to the society. And for the Jews and the Christians, this was called different, and the pagans as well. And they were guaranteed complete freedom to practice as they wish, and their religion, as far as they following obviously the main ways of how they coexisting, and they not disturbing the peace of Medina. And I think it's just, this obviously shows us the best way of how Islam allows us and even supports other minorities to coexist and also flourish. So Hazrat Muhammad ﷺ has also taught us that we should treat others the way that we want to be treated, and that's for obviously the people around you, your neighbors, how you to respect the society. And I think, as Roya mentioned, which is also Hazrat Umar, the second caliph of Islam, story, he did this for the Jews. But what he did for Christians was, I found it extremely fascinating. So I think not only he said that they're allowed to practice their religion as they would, he gave them also, like, he treated them as equal. There's one incident that when he was in the church, he was offered to pray in the church, and he specifically said that I don't want to pray inside the church, just because I don't want it to be taken from you. I don't want it to be shown as a significant place to Muslims because a caliph prayed there. And I want it to be exclusively for you. So he actually stepped out of the church and prayed outside of the church, which obviously is, I think, is absolutely amazing, admirable.
Which is a mosque now.
Which is a mosque now, because people accepted Islam. The Christians there in that part, they accepted Islam and they allowed it to be a mosque. But at that time, he specifically said that I don't want to pray, just so I don't want anyone to take it from you. So I found that extremely beautiful. And obviously that's safeguarding the rights of Christians and minorities in that area. Again, as you mentioned, Annie, in Andalus as well, that's called Golden Era for Jews, where they thrived. And even Christians, they all coexisted in a beautiful way in that area. And then I think in terms of the society as well, it achieved one of the highest intellectual eras in the Andalusian part. So I don't know how it's now brought about as the Muslims can't coexist. Absolutely, and that history dementia, as you mentioned, when they're removing all of this from history, and you really need to dig deep to find all of this. So whatever we're finding, it's not that you can just Google and then you can find. You have to read books that shows obviously the history, the right history of that time.
Absolutely.
And I mean, Andalus is a very interesting example as well, because it was, again, the Muslims did not just go in there just for the sake of, expanding their empire. It was also because in Spain, the Jews were not being tolerated and they were being persecuted. And it was for that reason that Muslims went into Spain to also protect the Jewish communities there. And then we see in the Andalusian history that Jews completely thrived in that society.
And I think when it came to in the Inquisition, the Spain Inquisition, the Jews went to the Ottoman Empire and they sought refuge there. So and the Ottoman Empire accepted them at the time. And as you said, it's probably that's one of the reasons as well that Dutch wanted their independence and they wanted the minorities to coexist peacefully. And obviously they both, there was a coalition or some sort of agreement between the Jews and the Ottoman Empire to grant the Dutch the independence as well. So yeah, and the Ottoman millet system as well, where they created a system where non-Muslims communities are allowed to govern themselves. So under the just the general governing of the society, the minorities are allowed to also have their own governing, and that's while remaining loyal to the state, which obviously that's grant autonomy to in terms of like personal law, the education, the worship of other minority groups as well. So yeah, I think if we go back to the Holy Quran, the way that we can establish peace and the way that it's mentioned in the Holy Quran and coexist peacefully is to act with justice. So it's mentioned in verse 4, chapter 136. O ye who believe, be strict in observing justice and be witnesses for Allah, even though it be against yourself or against parent and kindred, whether he be rich or poor. Allah is more regardful of them both than you are. Therefore, follow not low desires so that you may be able to act equitably. And if you conceal the truth or evade, then remember that Allah is well aware of what you do. So that sums everything beautifully. That's definitely not an intolerable religion. Obviously.
And so like it's really ironic to sort of see these parallels where you on one side have Western history that has quite a few, expulsion of Jews and the Holocaust and quite a few taints on their history when it comes to religious tolerance. And even like before the Holocaust, we've seen like so many examples of religious intolerance in Western history. And then you have the other side where you have Islamic history, where it like the big narrative, you can see that it's about tolerance, whether it be the Ottoman Empire or the Umayyad Empire in Andalusia, or at the time of the Holy Prophet ﷺ and his caliphs. It has been a culture of religious tolerance. So it's very interesting to see these two parallels and then draw the conclusion from that somehow Islam is the intolerant and the West is the tolerant.
Yeah. I mean, I find it very odd that in certain Western European countries specifically, they react a lot to this whole idea of immigration from Muslim populations when their populations still remain relatively small. But there are a number of other countries that at least look European, like Russia, for example, or parts of Eastern Europe that hold much greater populations of Muslims. But you don't hear the same vilification of Muslims from those countries. Like Russia, even at the moment, has around 10% or more Muslims, and it's projected to be like 25%, and then to grow to 25% in the next sort of generation, 20 to 50 years time. And then there's other countries like Georgia, which has around 35% Muslim population. And I just feel like, is it really that Muslims are intolerant, or is it that Europeans are intolerant of Muslims because they feel like they can't handle less than 10% Muslim population in their countries? I just feel like it's a bit hypocritical. They should kind of, as we were saying, look at their own histories as well, in terms of Islamic history and Islam in Europe, which, as you say, has had a bit of a dementia episode. I'm reading a really interesting book actually called Three Worlds, and it's a memoir by a professor called Avi Shleim, who's like a Jewish professor. He lives in Germany, I want to say Germany, but he had a really interesting life story being an Iraqi Jew. And he was born in Iraq, grew up there, and then with the instigation of and the basically the birth of Israel, there was a lot of terrorism and bombings that happened in Iraq at the time, which originally was subscribed to Iraqi nationalism and trying to get rid of the Jewish population in Iraq. But actually, a lot of the bombs were actually planted by Mossad at the time, and that was because so few of the Jews in Iraq had taken up the call from Israel to come and emigrate to Israel because they lived a comfortable life, they were happy in Iraq, and there are parts of Arab history where it's not perfect. Obviously, there is there is intolerance to certain groups of people. At the end of the day, it's human nature to try and isolate kind of groups of people as well.
And you see that when Islam is in decline. So when their faith is in decline, then you see that they become more extremist and radical towards other people of other faiths.
Yeah, absolutely. So reading into this book, he had a really interesting kind of history and the narrative that actually they were very sad to leave Iraq and start again essentially in Israel, growing up in Israel and then deciding that actually they don't want to live in Israel anymore, and they emigrated to a European country because they themselves received a lot of racism for being Arab.
Iraq,
so his kind of memoir is really interesting, and juxtaposing that to other Arab Jews, for example, like Saad Gad, I think his name is. He's like a Lebanese Arab Jewish person who is vehemently opposed to Islam because of his experiences and his family's experiences in Lebanon during the Civil War. So I just find it interesting hearing like these different narratives, and I wish I could hear more narratives from maybe other Arab Jews as well that could have possibly been like a beautiful bridge between maybe the Arab Muslim population in Palestine and Holy Lands in general. They could have been such an amazing bridge between Jews from Europe, essentially Ashkenazi Jews, etc., from Europe who came to the Middle East and the Arab population there. But that was just it was a lost opportunity. Noor, you used to live in Syria, which is a Muslim majority country, of course, but it has quite a large. At least it had large minority populations of other religious groups there. So, I mean, what kind of religious groups were there, and what was it like when you lived there in Syria?
So I think the biggest minority in terms of other religious group was Christians. At the time when I used to live there, the Christians were about 6% of the population. I haven't met any Syrian Jews, so I don't really know. And when I searched, what it appeared that there are not many at the moment. So I think mostly is migrated, as you mentioned, to like Israel when Israel was formed. But I had many encounters with Christians. In fact, my closest high school friend was Christian, and I don't think we looked at the religion at that time. I think, as you do, when you get to know the person, you just look past that part. And then you just look at the similarities that you have between each other rather than the differences. And I think the only time that we actually parted in school, because we were just in the same class, in Syria, the system is slightly different. So in the high school, you also stay in the same class. You don't move to different subjects. So the only subject that we didn't have together was the religious education. So in Syria, the Muslims sit and have their religious education and they get taught about Islam. And the Christians also get together and they're taught about Christianity, which at times I was like, oh, I wish I know a bit more about Christianity, because obviously you don't get taught about that. But then now thinking about it and reflecting about it, I found it really good, because they're not being forced to sit down with us, with the majority Muslims, and learn about Islam. They're in fact given that advantage of having their separate space, learning more about their religion, which I find really good. So yeah, my experience has been really, really good in Syria with Christians. I think the numbers has now declined after the civil war. So when I checked, I think it's around 2% now, the Christians in Syria. Again, I also have my experience in Ghana, and in Ghana I came as the other. So I was one of the minorities, and not only minorities in terms of like non-Ghanaian, I was also a Muslim. But I had a completely different, I had a really, really nice experience. And I think that stems from obviously what we talked about, the perception that they have on the person that comes, the perception of specific picture that they can see in front of them, the first interaction. And it was really interesting that in Ghana, I was mostly referred to as Hajia. which is a person who's performed Hajj.
Yeah.
And I think, obviously, I'm not Hajj. I haven't gone to Hajj, but I think this is also brings back the perception. But in fact, I was really respected. They treated me with like extreme respect. They knew that, okay, I require a little bit more boundaries in terms of like shaking hand, and they understood this, which I was really fascinated about. And then it's not really difficult to educate yourself, and that's when I came here as well, and also experienced something different where I have to also set up my boundaries. I have to obviously make people aware of what I believe, what I think, why I'm doing this, why I'm doing that. So it's really interesting, obviously, in all of these different countries, and then to see how different people perceive you as, and then the first interaction with them as well.
Yeah, absolutely. If we can go back to Gaza and the recent conflict in Gaza, if you turn back to Holland, how has the Gaza conflict kind of influenced the domestic politics? I know we talked a bit about the recent, the violence in Amsterdam recently, but how has it generally impacted the Dutch society?
Well, I think what you saw throughout Western countries like America and Europe as well is that especially like the students, there were massive student protests in Holland as well.
Yeah.
So you see that the younger generation is quite aware of what is happening. And I think now with the ICC warrants as well, people are starting to see the issue in Palestine for what it is, which gives us some hope. But at the same time, when you look statistically, we had our elections now about a year ago, and you saw in the statistics back then that it didn't really matter that much to the votes. So it is an issue for Dutch people, and like, especially the younger generation. You see some protests and things like this, but I would say the general public, it doesn't influence the way they want to form policy.
Yes, I see.
And I think that is painful in a way, because it also shows the lack of options there is when it comes to Dutch political parties, because not many, even the more left-leaning political parties, they're not as focused on the Palestinian issue, I think, as they probably should be, as it is, it is an ongoing genocide in our own lives. So the painful thing about that is that it sort of shows the hypocrisy when it comes to the Holocaust being a very integral part of Dutch culture, and regret about that. And I think all Dutch people have commemorated that throughout their lives. And now, where there is an ongoing genocide, where we always used to say that we will never have this again, it doesn't seem to be that big of an issue for them.
Yeah. Yes.
As in many Western countries, really.
Yeah.
We have sort of shut our eyes, and we like to focus on our own domestic issues when there is an ongoing genocide.
Yeah. And The Hague, and I always have to remember that The Hague is in the Netherlands, so I feel like their position should be more international as well. Like their concern should be also, maybe that's an extra burden for them as Dutch people, but I feel like the fact that you have The Hague and the international court system there, you would take more of an interest and try and have that as part of your political voting kind of standpoint in a way. I just wanted to turn to the next video, which shows one of your Dutch diplomats who has actually resigned at protesting. She protested because of what was happening in Gaza.
My name is Angelique Eipen. I'm a former Dutch diplomat. Amongst others, I worked at our embassy in Muscat as a deputy ambassador and at our Middle East desk here in The Hague. Given the Dutch policy with regard to Gaza, I could no longer be part of the organization because it was no longer in line with both my professional and personal integrity to continue working there. I wrote a lot in the resignation letter. I wrote about the moral standing that we had lost. The Netherlands, for example, has refused to define what's going on as war crimes or potential war crimes. We have abstained twice in the UN General Assembly where it comes to voting for a ceasefire. We are here in The Hague, capital of peace and justice. All of that has our credibility has really suffered an extreme blow.
It's really unfortunate, isn't it? Like you're saying there are no options, but here she is. She could be one of the leaders. But I think there's no support, obviously, fostering that view. So she found that the best decision that she could make is just resign and stay away from this.
Absolutely. Yeah. And like what I meant by a lack of options is like more of the established parties not being as vocal about it as they probably should be. And it is very sad, and it shows a lot about Holland, I think, that we are the capital, as she says, of justice. At least we should be when we host the ICC. And still now there are talks of not complying with the ICC warrants. So we're not only not supporting the ICC in their work and being vocal about it as a country on like an international platform. We have abstained from voting for a ceasefire. We are now trying to make up ways to get around the warrants. So that's quite a stain, I think, on Dutch politics. That as the host of the ICC, we are taking such measures.
Is it a blip then? One of these MPs like resigning? Just a blip in the overall trend, do you think?
I'm afraid it is. I'm afraid it is, because at least in like domestic politics, there was like a small like crisis in cabinet about like the debate after the riots, but that was pretty quickly they patched up. And it wasn't really even about the Palestinian issue. And now when we see the talks about the ICC as well, I don't think it's going to structurally change as much as we would like to see. Yeah, I think that Dutch politics would really need like a breath of fresh air to understand this. Yeah.
I think that the principle that we actually mentioned earlier within Islam, that actually within the Quranic verse, which basically says you should seek justice, even if it means, justice means that you yourself will get in trouble, or those closest to you, your family members, your kin, get in trouble. You must hold absolute justice. And I think, given the fact that, again, The Hague is in Netherlands, they're trying to worm their way out of absolute justice at the moment, given the legal premise of the ICC warrants. And it's a trial, so the arrest warrants are there to try and establish the truth and establish justice. And if you're not willing to even go through the process of having a trial and go back on your words, means that there will be a grave injustice potentially that the politicians are now seeking to try and worm their way out of this situation. If they just kind of stick by that principle, which we could all agree on, but we're reminded of in the Quran, which is you have to seek justice even if it means you're going to get in trouble.
Yes.
So
yes, and I mean, I think the riots definitely played a role in that as well. That because it was framed so quickly, and that it was like made up to be a media hype internationally as well. The Dutch, or like Holland, was almost framed as this anti-Semitic country, or like a country in which Jews are in danger because of the Muslim population.
Yeah.
And I think that also might have played a role in how we're now dealing with the ICC, which is very painful, because apparently our sort of reputation is more important to us than justice. And a reputation which also we shouldn't want to have. We shouldn't want to have a reputation of supporting a genocidal state, So yeah, I mean, and again, it is in the small words that you also really find the hypocrisy regarding the Palestinian issue. When, for instance, they were very quick to use terms like Jew hunt and pogroms when it came to the riots. But then when it comes to Israel's genocide, they often just go with words like a complex conflict, or like a historically complicated issue, or like the Israeli issue, or like the Gazan issue.
Yeah.
So they try to use very neutral words and very nuanced words to describe an event for which, people are now hopefully being held accountable as war criminals.
Yeah.
But when it came to a night where we didn't have a lot of facts about it, we didn't have any numbers or, any research about this, they were very quick to say, it was Jew hunt.
Extreme,
and it was anti-Semitic Muslims who are incompatible with our society, and their citizenship should be taken away.
Yeah. Is there any light at the end of this tunnel? within the general political structure? I don't know, in terms of trying to be more inclusive or at least less exclusive of the Muslim community, or with the arrest warrants and things. Do you feel like there's a bit of a green light? I don't know.
I mean, as I was saying before, I really hope and pray that the Dutch people can see through this, and that the Dutch people realize what their ancestors have given for religious freedom, and the sacrifices they made for our ideals. And I really, really hope that the Dutch people will see this and realize that Muslims are an integral part of Dutch society, not for the past 50 years, but for the past 500 years. And I think it is only through some more historical awareness, maybe, and also just regaining our reputation as a tolerant society and as a society in which religious freedom is really, really important, that we can see that light at the end of the tunnel. And I hope that politics will shift in the Netherlands as well to regain this narrative.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. I see this light. I've got my finger crossed for the next generation. And although there are many disadvantages of media and having all of this exposure to all of the things that are going on, I think the next generation, I can feel that they're more aware. They are really looking at the bigger picture. They are, and I can see it in the youngsters when they're talking about the Gaza situation, obviously the genocide that is happening. And I feel they're understanding it a bit more. So I'm really hopeful that maybe this knowledge that they're getting now could come in handy when the politicians of the future are coming into place.
Inshallah, yeah.
Inshallah.
I mean, I definitely hope so as well, that the younger generation will be able to change the narrative, or to give, to regain this cultural identity that we have of religious freedom and religious tolerance.
Yeah.
Okay,
I think we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us, Roya.
Jazakallah for having me.
Yeah, and I think it'd be useful if we'll try and put a link down to the interview that we had with your dad, actually, who spoke a lot about the impact of Islam in Europe, but also within Dutch society. You've touched upon it, but he goes into a lot of detail in his scholarship about the issue. So we'll definitely leave the link available for our viewers to go and have a look. And thank you for watching. I hope we'll be able to see you on our next episode. But please do comment down below. Please subscribe and support the channel. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Peace be upon you.